in the last section for fill stitches that we're going to discuss, we're going to focus on the density. And this is a really neat lesson, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I did when I first created one of these density charts that we're gonna discuss in here. But fill stitch density and the stitch length go hand in hand. You cannot discuss one without the other when it comes to fill stitches. The stitch length used in the fill stitch makes a difference in the density needed to maintain a full coverage look, meaning you don't see any fabric through. So the stitch length will actually affect the density that you need to use to create that full covered look over the top of your material. The longer the stitch length is, the lighter the density will be required to maintain that full covered look. Again, the longer the stitch length, the lighter the density required. The shorter the stitch length, the greater or the heavier the density will need to be in order to maintain a full covered look. So when we're talking about stitch length, we're talking about the distance between needle penetration points. Okay, so the longer, the more distance from one needle penetration to the other will actually, the longer it is, the less density, which is the distance between rows, the less density that you'll have to use. The shorter that distance is between needle penetrations, the heavier, the greater the density you will have to use. And this will all become apparent when we get into the lesson and when you actually stitch it out, and it'll amaze you just how this works. So in the lesson, we're going to be stitching out this density chart, and you'll see in this density chart that we have a density that goes down for each column. It's the same down each column, and then we have a stitch length that's the same stitch length for the row. So in this row, for instance, it's going to use a 3 millimeter long stitch length for each one of these boxes. The only difference between each one of these boxes is the density used. So the stitch length stays the same, but the density changes. Same thing with this row. The stitch length remains the same, but the density changes. And the one thing that I want to point out to you here is that there's a big difference in the number of stitches between each box. For instance, when you stitch this box out, it's using a 3 millimeter long stitch length, which is a pretty small stitch length for a fill stitch. It's one that a lot of people use, but it's relatively small. And it's using a 0.3 density, and the 0.3 density is pretty thick. It's a pretty thick density. You typically don't use a 0.3 density because that's very hard on the fabric, and it's actually too many stitches, more stitches than what's needed to cover the fabric. But in this box right here, using a 3 millimeter stitch length with a 0.3 millimeter density, has 1,028 stitches in it. Now let's go down to the bottom right box. This one uses a 6 millimeter long stitch length, which is pretty long, and it uses a 0.7 density, which is pretty light, but it only has 338 stitches. So you've got this one that's 1,028 stitches, this one that's 338 stitches. And notice that as you go down each row, when we're only talking about the stitch length being different, not the density, and the density is the distance between rows. So in this case, using a 3 millimeter long stitch length with the 0.3 density, you have 1,028 stitches. Coming down to the bottom, the only difference with this is the stitch length used. Okay, so it's using the same density, but it has only 668 stitches. Okay, it's not quite half, but pretty close to half the number of stitches in the same size box. And so the interesting thing when doing this and stitching it out is that you're going to find that even though the density is a lot tighter, meaning it's more dense on the left hand side, and it's the least dense on the right hand column, you're going to find that the density required to fill the area is actually going to cover the area better using a lighter density but a longer stitch length. Okay, so a lighter density, meaning you're over here maybe in the 0.5 area, with a longer stitch length is going to cover the material better than a short stitch length with a tighter density. So for instance, if you stitch it out and you find that, hey, this 0.5 density with the 5 millimeter long stitch length covers the fabric, totally covers it, you don't see any of the material coming through, and it has 458 stitches, and then you look at this box up here and it looks like it covers it full, but you're looking at 1028 stitches as opposed to 458. Which one do you want to use in your design that you do? Obviously you want to use the one with the fewest number of stitches possible. So you're going to want to use this one that's 458 stitches. And this is just a really, really good lesson, and it really opens your eyes up to how much the stitch length affects the overall coverage of the stitches, because it is most common that when people see thread or see fabric showing through their stitches, the first thing that they always do is they go to the density and they change the density. They make the density tighter, and so that they can try to make sure that that fabric doesn't show through. But that's not really what you want to do. You want to actually look at the stitch length at the same time, because what you'll find is that it's probably more of a short stitch length used with the proper density, but all you need to do is change the stitch length and you can keep that density the same. And by increasing the stitch length, you're actually going to reduce the number of stitches, and it's going to actually feel lighter, because you got to think about density or stitch length this way too, because this is another good thing to discuss about the length of stitches, is that a lot of people talk about bulletproof designs, and it's the one thing that everyone says is like, oh, it's so stiff, it's bulletproof, you can hardly bend the design. And at one point I had somebody come to me and they showed me this design. They're like, oh, it's so stiff, it's so hard, it's like bulletproof design. And then they went and they wanted to just lighten the density. Well, the moment they lightened the density, what happened is they started seeing fabric through it, right? And so what I did is I explained to them, like, it's not the density that you need to adjust here. You're using such a short stitch length, and because you're using such a short stitch length, it's driving the thread into the fabric more, and it's making it look like it's not filling the area as much because it's driving down in it instead of floating on top of the fabric. The longer the stitch length, the more it floats and rests on top of the fabric. The shorter stitch length, the more it drives it down into the fabric. Okay, so just by keeping the density the exact same in that design and only changing the stitch length, it made that design go from feeling tight and bulletproof to feeling loose. And that's because you got to think of every time that the needle goes down and it connects with that bobbin, the shorter that distance is to each other, the number of times it goes down, the closer that is, the more it has to make that loop, and it's like a little knot, right? And so that makes it stiffer. Once you open it up and you make that stitch length longer, now you have a little bit more distance between the thread and the bobbin combining together or locking together, and that's going to make it a lot softer, so you're going to be able to bend it more. So let's go ahead and let's open up the software lesson here. I'm going to bring it up, and this is what it looks like, and it looks just like what I showed you on that screen. So if I take it off 3D view, you're going to notice that I have two designs here. I have one for knit material and one for woven. And the reason that I have one for each is because when you're doing knit fabric, you really want to have a different underlay than when you're working on a woven fabric. So the only difference between these two designs is the underlay settings. Okay, so you're going to want to use the knit file for knits and the woven file for a woven material. And when I click on this, I'm going to select it, and you'll see that with it selected, you're going to see that the density is 0.3 and the stitch length is 3. So each of these boxes, it's going to be what you see here is what it's going to be. And so when you go to stitch it out, you're going to be able to know that you're following this example, this grid. So what you do is when you stitch this out, when you're done, you really want to take a look at the design. And you're going to be looking to see if you can see fabric between the stitches or not. Okay, so you're gonna look at it, and you're gonna find, okay, what combination of density and stitch length gave me the best look, a full covered look, but with the fewest amount of stitches. Okay, so as you go from left to right, the stitches or the number of stitches will be reduced, and the same as if you go down, fewer stitches are going to be used from the previous one above it. Okay, so the goal is to find that perfect combination. So when you're examining your design, you're looking at it and you see that it's fully covered, and you locate those. You'll come back into the software and you'll take a look at it, or you'll just look at the chart and you'll see, okay, what was used? Well, if it was this one, it was using a 0.5 density with a 4 millimeter long stitch length. And if that's the one you decide looks the best, that's what you want to go with when you're creating your fill stitches. And the other thing that I want you to do after you stitch it out is I want you to take it in your hand, and I want you to go to where this box is right here, and just kind of bend it with your fingers, bend that section right there, and then go down to maybe right here, the 0.5 with the 4 millimeter stitch length, and bend it, and just feel the difference. After you bend it, go back to the first one. Go do it a few times between the boxes, even the last one. What you're going to find is the ones that have the shorter stitch length, like a 0.3, they're going to be much harder than the ones that use a longer stitch length or firmer. They're going to feel more bulletproof than the ones that use a longer stitch length. And so not only are you going to look for what covers the fabric the best, but you're also going to bend the different boxes and just notice the difference in how they feel and how stiff they are, or how nice and loose and buttery feeling they are. So that's how you want to utilize the density chart, and the goal is to find the settings that give you full coverage but with the fewest amount of stitches. Okay, so if I come back to this PowerPoint, you'll see here that you want to get your stitch count as low as possible. So just locate all of those that cover the fabric the best, and then decide, okay, well, this one only has 458 stitches and it covers about the same as what this one does. Well, I want to use this combination because it has less stitches. And that's kind of what you do with this density chart. So I hope that makes sense. It's a great lesson. Make sure you stitch out the knit and the woven density charts and go from there. And hopefully you'll learn as much as I did about stitch length when you do this for yourself.